Okay, folks, part of my nights and weekends plan, I put together some pieces about architecture that I hope can help people who've taken our classes just to kind of see more and learn a little bit more about how things are laid up, or maybe give them a different way to look at them. So in the last section, we talked about architecture and the kind of core law, right? Everything in ServiceNow is just a record in a table somewhere. And understanding that table architecture is an important part. And when we did that, I went through an existing table in ServiceNow, a very common table, the user table, and we kind of peeled it. And we saw that even the navigation going from the menus was a record in the menu module table. Going to the modules was a record in the module table, and the modules let us steer towards the list that was the users, and so on. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take that to the next step. We're going to actually do that in reverse. We're going to build something and we're going to architect the components. Now in the beginning, the first examples will be pretty basic and they'll be done on the global scope. We'll include some talk about update sets, but in subsequent versions of these little videos, we'll get into a little more detail. Right now, the focus is just going to be that table architecture and thinking about architecting things in building and update sets. So whenever we're building something, we need a reason or a use case, or maybe we might call it a requirement. And in this case, I've got some requirements kind of spec'd out. We want to build a table that tracks airports, locations, and names. We'll try to make it as simple and straightforward as possible. That airport table should have reference to the locations, preferably that are accessible in the locations table. I might want this airport table to be accessible anywhere. Because if I think about it, no matter what I'm doing, I might need to know where's the nearest airport, right? So in that case, we're going to build this in the global scope. And we'll talk more about scopes, but the idea that this would be common, I might even go so far as to say just that, it would be common to the system. And that actually brings up a point that I want to kind of point out to people in the underlying architecture. There are some table naming conventions that we have. And though I think they've never been formalized, it does help to understand them when we're looking at existing things. So, for example, some of the prefixes that we see are just that. Things that are common might be CMN. So common refers to tables that are commonly accessed by all the other applications in the system, but don't change any functional behavior for the system. Speaking of systems, another prefix you may see is sys. So we know in the last video when we took the user table, that was the sys user table. Sys tables are generally, not always, but generally, tables that create or affect functionality across the system. And it makes sense if you think about it, right? The user table is necessary to use any application in ServiceNow. So it is a system-wide functional component of doing any work. So there's common and sys. What are some other ones we might use? Well, another one you might see is imp. And imp would, of course, imply import. And those tables we'll talk about when we do a section on importing a little bit. Import tables serve a little bit like staging tables or quarantine tables. We can import data from external sources, leave them in that import table, and then we can kind of clean them up before we bring them out into the world where they belong, into their target tables. So we have common, sys, imp. Another one you might see if you're building stuff directly, as we are in this case, is U. That U implies that it's user generated. And then the other one that we'll see as we get into scoped applications is X underscore our company. Whatever that company's name is, or that company's designated ServiceNow initials are. So CLD in many of the ServiceNow training class examples, or something along those lines. In ServiceNow, of course, it's X underscore SNC underscore whatever the name of the app is. So that actually is kind of a nice little underlying architecture component to consider. And now we have the requirements. So we know we're going to build a table. It's going to call it a U table, but we might call it a CMN table later if we want to rename it, because it'll be commonly accessed everywhere. The other thing that we want to make sure as we think about these requirements is we want to track this, and we're going to do that through update sets. I hear in almost every single class questions and curiosities and concerns about update sets. So I'm going to do two videos with regard to update sets. One on the setting them up, which I'll do right now, because we're about to do some design. Should be tracked in an update set. The other we'll talk about more detail about pulling things out of an update set and what happens when they break. So let's talk update sets, and we'll get rid of this guy for now. First off, there's a way to make it possible to see update sets, and it's pretty straightforward. If I were to click the gear right here over on the left, if I'm the system administrator, I'll have a right down here for developer. If I choose developer, I can see application pickers. Those are the big picture pieces that we use when we build functionally separate applications. And we'll talk more about that later as well. But then update set picker, which allows me to see the different update sets. So that's a first and always when I'm using a system. Now, update sets are, of course, as everything else, a record in a table, right? And if I go to build an update set, the place that I want to start is local update sets. And if I click on local update sets, you'll see the system always has a default update set. It's useful and helpful to know that default update sets are in the system regardless. They are the tracking that sometimes support can use if they want to see what's been done functionally to change the system, because that's what an update set does. It tracks functional changes made to the system. Now, we want to be able to track our own changes and to migrate them to other systems. So we want to create our own named update set. When we create update sets, one of the things that we want to do is come up with a couple standard rules. Now, I know the books and the classes frequently talk about the core things to think about is a naming convention, right? In my case, I'm going to call this ARC 1, and I'll put in, my name. Now, that's as far as I think the book goes. They mention that it's important and useful to document in the description. I'm going to add a couple of other things that are handy in terms of rules for update sets. Just good practices, if you will. Number one, I want to know why I made the update changes that I did, and it's easy enough to click on the attachments and attach the thing that drove the update set. So the requirement, the document, some people say, well, I got my requirements in an email. That's fine. PDF the email and attach that. In my case, it was notes doc, so I can just grab that document and bring it in. That way I have that record. Interestingly enough, that attached doc will come through even in the even when I retrieve the update set on another system. So it's nice to kind of have that and be aware that that information's come across and to know that I have that stuff there. Last but not least, and I always like to make sure I do this, I learned this actually from an administrator of a production system. And what he had said was, Sean, the one thing we want to make sure is that people are accountable. Now, you guys are more than welcome if you're unfamiliar with the concept of RACI or responsible, accountable, consulted, or informed. But accountable means, not to quote the Highlander or anything, but there can be only one. There's only one person accountable. Maybe in the US we'd call that the one throat to choke, right? But we want that one person that we can call if we're implementing an update set if there's a problem. And it's amazing how often the person who had suggested this, he said, I want the accountable person's name and email and phone. And what he said, and then maybe some work notes in the update set. Now, one of the things he said that I thought was so cool about this was, he said, oftentimes people will tell me we have to put this update set through. But as soon as I tell them I will not do that unless you give me the phone number that I can call you at, suddenly the people building the update sets are like, well, let me get back to you on that. Let me double check it just to be sure. So those are some good practices that I hope you pick up about update sets, maybe a little more than the book. We're going to submit and make current. And as soon as I do that, you'll notice that I'm now tracking. And from this point on, if I'm looking in that window, it says I'm doing stuff in that update set. Now I can begin to actually build the table that I have specified in the system. So I want people to know that that's what's going on next, and that will be our next recording. Hope this has been helpful. Next recording, we'll build a table and see the constituent pieces that are built by default in the ServiceNow Table Architecture. Thanks.